So the Lewis and Clark Courthouse, I think, is probably the most overlooked landmark in Montana because it was built as the territorial capital when Helena was the Capitol building. It was built in about 1885, 1886, and statehood didn't happen until 1889. And upon statehood, this became the first state capitol building, and it was the state capitol until 1902 when the present capitol was finished. So this building is so important for that reason, but it's also important because it is a fabulous example of how the railroad, when the railroad came to Helena in 1883, how the railroad really changed the way Helena looks, because it made possible the importation of all kinds of ornamentation for our buildings, including this red porphyry trim that came all the way from Bayfield, Wisconsin on the train. It decorates this building and also the Securities Bank building downtown. So it's really, you know, a very important building for the architecture and also for its symbolic importance. Up above here, the plaque that tells you who the commissioners were when the building was constructed. Right above that tablet, it says Lewis and Clark County, and this is really one of the only examples of the old spelling of Lewis and Clark County, because originally it was spelled Clark with an E. But in 1903, when the journals of Lewis and Clark were first published, they had to decide which was the proper spelling of Clark, with or without an E. And the Historical Society librarian, Laura Howie, did a lot of research and determined that Clark's military records were actually spelled without an E. So that was the proper spelling of Clark. So it meant that, oops, Lewis and Clark County was misspelled, and it took an act of the legislature to correct the spelling. So this is one of those old reminders, and probably the only one that I know, public one. So the Lewis and Clark County Courthouse really is a very important landmark, and that whole area is, typically historically it was a really, really busy place, and it's a very very important area because it was always the place where the county courthouse was, even back to 1867. Courthouse Square was laid out as the place for the courthouse. So it became the place when the territorial capital moved to Helena. It became the place where lawyers and judges and any kind of state or territorial official, did business there. And so there's some very interesting things about Courthouse Square that I think people don't really know. The livery barn there, the Allen livery, which now has the chain link fence around the parking lot there. So that building was really important because just like today you have to have a place to park your car, you had to have a place to park your horse, and you could leave your horse at the livery barn. You could also rent any kind of carriage that you wanted. There's a ghost sign on the side of the building that says, you can't hardly read it, but if you really scrutinize it, what it says is funeral hacks. So you could rent funeral carriages, if you had to have a procession to the cemetery, you needed to rent probably a horse-drawn hearse or something, and you could rent that there at the livery stable. Also, that I think is important about that area to the west side. So that was the Helena Classical School in the mid-1880s, and it was one of the few private schools here in town, and it was founded so that people could study Greek and Latin, which they couldn't study in public schools. And a lot of times kids were sent out of state or back east, to boarding schools. And so this was an alternative. It only lasted a couple of years, but that building is really cool for that reason. I think it's a very early building. And the bail bonds building here started out as a one-story building that was the Territorial Law Library, and the upper stories were added later And it was also shared space with the public library. So it was one of the early places where the Lewis and Clark Public Library actually became, before it became the public library, located here with the Territorial Law Library. The jail, of course, the what's now the Myrna Loy, Lewis and Clark County Jail is not the first jail that was built there. There was a previous jail that was there, since the 1860s. And so it's always been the place where the prisoners were. And I think it's an interesting story. There's a lot of different stories, but I think maybe my favorite has to do with Seth Bullock, who was the sheriff of Lewis and Clark County from about 1872 until 1875 or so. And, Seth Bullock is the famous sheriff of Deadwood. And if you've ever watched that series, Deadwood, he's the major character. But he was the sheriff here in Lewis and Clark County before Deadwood was ever founded. And so as the sheriff in that area there where the previous jail was, in 1875, he conducted the very first legal hanging in the territory of Montana. And he made a mistake, actually, because he built the gallows, and there was a law that said that the public is not supposed to witness these events, although they sent out invitations to all the different sheriffs and press people and stuff, and there were a lot of people that were invited to come and watch, but the public wasn't supposed to be able to observe it. So anyway, he built this gallows, this rather elaborate gallows, and then he realized that he had built a fence around the gallows, but the fence was too low and the gallows were too high, and it was obvious that people would be able to see what was going on. So the hanging was supposed to have taken place on the 13th of the month. I think it was June or July 1875. And usually these hangings were scheduled, so they took place on Friday the 13th, just because of whatever. So it was supposed to take place Friday the 13th at 9 o'clock in the morning. And in order to prevent the public from viewing this hanging, he changed the time to 1 minute after midnight on Friday, which would be Friday the 13th still, but it would be dark so that people wouldn't be able to observe it. But unfortunately, word got out that he had done that, and there was a full moon that night, and there were hundreds of people that climbed the rooftops in the warehouses and areas and businesses around there. So everybody had a really good view of the hanging after all. And it did occur 1 minute after midnight. So the Myrna Loy then was actually, the replacement jail, and it was built around 1890. And of course, it's built in the style of architecture, Romanesque style architecture, so that form follows function. It's built to look like a place where there's a dungeon. It's not a place where you really want to be. The architecture is beautiful, but it's rather forbidding on purpose. Where the courthouse parking lot is, was originally the site of the First Presbyterian Church, which sat right here on the corner, basically where I'm standing. And I've always thought it was interesting because the house across the street here, this little house on the corner, was the home of Jacob Feldberg. And his bay window there looked right into the side of the Presbyterian Church. Jacob Feldberg and his family were part of the Jewish community, the early Jewish community here in Helena. And Jacob Feldberg actually became very famous because we had a lot of serious fires here in Helena. And during one of those fires in the 1870s, the Feldbergs lived here in the neighborhood, not necessarily in this house, but they did live in this neighborhood. And he had a clothing store that was, I think, fell victim several different times to fires. So during this one fire in the early 1870s, his business was again threatened, and he was down there, you know, hanging around the firemen, and asked the fireman what he could do to help. And the fireman said, "Jacob, just go away and leave us alone. You're too little to do any good." And he was a very small statured person, and he felt really, really bad. So he began to climb up the hill, the Broadway hill, to his house. And he noticed that people were gathered on the sidewalks watching the fire down on the gulch, but he began to notice that the wind was whipping through the gulch, as it often does. And the embers were being blown into the neighborhood. And so these burning embers were lighting on the rooftops here on this street on Fifth Avenue. And he ran up and organized a bucket brigade and said, you know, everybody help me, come and help me. And everyone sort of organized. He jumped from the rooftops and put those burning embers out. And because of his heroic deeds that day, he became known as Helena's Paul Revere, because he warned the neighborhood that the fire was coming. And across the street, there is a beautiful French Second Empire home that is, I think it's 3 stories. It's a beautiful, beautiful house. It's very elaborate. And that house is very significant to Helena's history because it was the very first YWCA. And when the YWCA moved in there in 1911, they were, you know, sort of, it was a fledgling organization at that time. And Frida Fliegelman, who was a prominent member of the Jewish community, was the secretary. And she and Dr. Mariah Dean were the 2 driving forces behind the founding of the YWCA in 1911. And when it came time to affiliate in about 1912, 1913, because they had a rule, this was the Young Women's Christian Association, anyone who was not a Christian was not allowed to be on boards or have any say in the management of the chapters. And because Frida was so instrumental in helping to found the YWCA, the chapter chose not to affiliate with the national organization. And into the 1980s, it was the only non-affiliated YWCA chapter in the nation. But it is now affiliated. But because of Frida and her great work, you know, they chose not to follow that rule and not to affiliate, which I think is pretty wonderful. So the house behind me here was built in about 1903 as the executive residence of Governor Joseph K. Toole. The Tooles lived originally over on Rodney Street, actually on the corner of Rodney and State, and that house still stands. But it wasn't really grand enough for the governor. He was the governor of the first governor of Montana, was the territorial governor when statehood was declared in 1889. And then he ran for a second term in 1900. So he was serving his second term, and he and his wife decided that they needed to have a better residence, you know, for the governor so that they could better entertain. The state of Montana didn't have its own executive mansion until 1913, and until then, the governors had to supply their own residences as the executive mansion. So anyway, they built this home here in 1903, but Mrs. Toole was really not really liking the idea of building a house here on this corner because of the proximity to the jail and the courthouse. And she kept telling her husband, you know, I just have a really bad feeling about this. What if something happens? What if a prisoner escapes? You know, we could be in danger. And he said, oh, that'll never happen. Well, in fact, it did happen, actually. They had only been in residence at the house about 6 months when there was a prisoner, Ike Gravel, who was a really bad character. He was on trial for extortion. He had tried to blow up a bridge with 235 people on this train. He tried to blow up this Northern Pacific train as it went over the bridge. He failed, but he was caught. And anyway, he had been in trouble before, had been tried for other crimes too. But he was in the middle of the trial, and he was taken from the courthouse to the jail over the lunch hour, and somebody slipped him a gun. So he had this gun concealed, and when they were bringing him back into the courthouse from the jail after lunch, he overpowered the deputy, stole his weapon, so now he had two guns, shot the deputy dead, and took off running from the jail all the way down what's now the parking lot toward this house. So Mrs. Toole and her two little boys were up in the window there watching this happening, and of course they were scared to death. And so pretty soon there was a train of people behind this guy. There was a butcher with his cleaver supposedly, and there was a barber with his scissors, and they were chasing him, and he came down to the sidewalk. There was a person that was walking along the sidewalk, a woman, and she just barely escaped getting shot because there was this gunfire between Gravel and the law enforcement and these other people that were chasing him. So he ended up going around the corner of the house here into the stairwell that goes down to the basement. There's an outer entrance to the basement. And according to one story, he turned the gun on himself and committed suicide. But according to reports, it's possible that actually the officer shot him. We don't really know exactly the real story there. But anyway, he ended up with his head at the foot of the basement stairs, which was pretty freaky for the Tooles. Later on, this house, has had a lot of different uses. Now it is the home of an attorney and has been here, not the home, but the office of an attorney has been here for a long time in that use. And as it was being converted into the offices that it is now, there was an interesting incident. They were destroying or removing a brick wall that sort of walled off Mrs. Toole's old garden. And they needed more parking back there, so the backhoe was working to remove this garden wall, and they found a bunch of clothing and a shoe. And work stopped. They called the deputy, they called the sheriff. The coroner came. They were thinking maybe it was a crime scene. Turned out there were no human remains associated, although there were some dog bones or some animal bones associated with this. And so the speculation at the time was that there had been some kind of a dump there. But if you look at the historic photographs and maps, there was never any kind of a privy or dump right there in that site. So my theory is, and this is just my theory, but I know that there was a tradition of burying one shoe or clothing or other relics underneath a threshold or underneath a wall to prevent bad spirits from coming in. And the theory was, that if there were bad spirits coming into the house or into the garden, the spirit would enter the shoe or the clothing instead of the actual structure. So maybe that's why those things were found there. But anyway, it's interesting to speculate. There is a wonderfully sad tombstone in Benton Avenue Cemetery that marks the grave of Gussie Bach. And it has this probably the saddest epitaph I think I have ever read. And it says, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing here, "Thus clutching that little spar, the mother drifted out to the unknown sea." And she was buried with her newborn baby. They both died. It was the third child that had died, that she'd had. And their house was here before the Chessman place was built. I just think that's really so sad. So the Chessman Apartments were built by the same Chessman that built the original governor's mansion just across the street. And he was usually he's looked at as a very prominent person. He was a very wealthy, very prominent person who owned a lot of mining interests. He was an owner of the first water company, and was a very prominent person, but he lost his complete fortune in the panic of 1893 when the silver market crashed, and ended up having to live in one of the apartments here that he built. He had built the governor's mansion across the street in 1886, I believe, and the family lived there until the crash, and then they eventually moved into the apartments that he built. And these are really wonderful townhouse apartments that were built in the 1880s. Very high class. It was really kind of unusual to have townhouses like that. As the Northern Pacific came into Helena in 1883, with it came a huge influx of population, and so it was important to have housing for a lot of people, and there wasn't a lot of room, and so townhouses and apartment buildings became popular because of that. But anyway, these are really beautifully preserved. As I mentioned before, the governor didn't have an executive residence owned by the state until 1913, when the state purchased this particular house for that purpose. Before that, the Chessman family lived here. After that, the Larsons lived there, and in 1913 it became the executive mansion. Governor Stewart was the first governor to live there, and thereafter all Montana's governors lived there until 1959. In 1959, the state built the current governor's mansion, which is a very modern house, and this place was in the possession of the city, but there were a lot of original furnishings in there, and so the city wasn't sure what was going to happen to the house. So they hired a caretaker because they were afraid someone would break in, and there were a lot of pieces of valuable pieces of furniture in there. So this lady was caretaker there for a couple of years. I had the pleasure of interviewing her when she was quite elderly a few years ago, and I asked her if there were any ghost stories that she knew of associated with the house, and she said, there are two of them, and she said that she loved living there because it was a place where the doorbell rang a lot, and she would answer the door, and there would be grown-up kids of former governors, at the doorway. And she would always invite them in, and they would tell her what it was like to be a kid growing up in the governor's mansion. We had very prolific governors, so there were a lot of kids that grew up in that house. And so she told me that the kids didn't necessarily know each other, but of the ones that she talked to, they all mentioned two different things. One thing that they remembered was that up on the second floor, there was a famous little cat. It was a black cat, and this little cat would come bounding down the hallway, and as they would bend down to pick it up, and their fingers closed around its little body, the cat would disappear. So this little famous ghost cat, I heard this story, and I thought, that's a really cool story, but how am I ever going to prove that there was a cat that lived in the house, The next day after I heard that story, and this is absolutely true, the next day I heard my boss, Kirby Lambert, tell a story about dogs. He had a program about dogs in Montana history. And as a joke, he threw in this one photograph. And the photograph was of the Chessman family out in their front yard in the 1890s. And sitting on a table with a tablecloth on it is a black cat. And there's a professional photographer photographing the family cat. So I know that there was a black cat that lived in the mansion at one time. The other story that she told me is about the It. And everybody who lived in the house, kids, all knew about the It. And couldn't exactly articulate what the it was, but they all called it the it. And it was something that was up on the second floor, and there was one doorway that was very difficult to shut that went to a closet. And they would make sure that this door was shut when they went to bed at night. And sometimes in the morning, the door would be open, and they would know that the it had been around. And so she said that, the kids were all just really kind of terrified of this thing they called the it. So in looking at historic photographs, there's a series of photographs that were taken by a professional photographer in 1913 when the Stewarts first moved in. And there's one photograph of the entryway, and up in the beautiful woodwork that's still there today is this weird misty thing that I always think of as the it. Professional photographer that worked for the Historical Society, J.M. Cooper, told me that, photographers didn't keep pictures like that, and why it even got kept, nobody knows, but it does have this weird anomaly. And he told me that one time he was taking photographs of the outside for a promotional brochure, and he said, my equipment is really good, and I never get those kinds of pictures, but he said, this one time, he said, there was that same weird misty thing in the bushes. So the it is still around. So this house is one of the oldest houses in the neighborhood. It was built in about 1872 by the Child family. Mr. Child was the founder of what's now the Kleffner Ranch, and he had his in-town residence here and built that octagonal house out there that is now on the Kleffner property. But anyway, this is a really, really, really historic home. And behind it, the barn is listed in the National Register, and it is a barn where Charlie Russell spent a winter painting. So I think it's really interesting to note that on this corner where this house is standing today, originally this was the lot that had the home of Territorial Governor Benjamin Potts on it. It was torn down after about 1901 or so when they built this house here. But for a long time, the Potts family lived here. There were a number of territorial governors that did live here in the neighborhood during the 1870s and 1880s. Anyway, the house that's here today is known as the Wellington Rankin house because in the 1960s, Wellington Rankin, who was the brother of Jeanette, the famous congresswoman from Montana, he bought the house and actually passed away before he and his wife could move in. But it is known as the Wellington Rankin house, and now it's a bed and breakfast, and there is a bedroom that is named the Jeanette Rankin room in Jeanette's honor. So Colleen, who is the hostess here, told me that one time she had a couple of college professors who were staying at the bed and breakfast, and they were out very, very late this one night, and they, she couldn't really lock the house up until everyone was in. So she was up in the Jeanette Rankin room, changing the bedding, and she was waiting for them to come in, and finally she heard the front door open, and she heard them come up the steps, and it was very late. So she didn't feel like it was proper to make conversation with them. So she dimmed the lights, and she sat down on the bed and watched the two men pass by. They went to their respective rooms. And the next morning when they came down to breakfast, she asked if they'd slept well. And they kind of hemmed and hawed, and finally one of them cleared his throat and said, well, not really. And she said, well, why not? What's wrong? And he said, well, is this house haunted? And she said, well, no, I don't think so. Why do you ask? Well, he said, we came in really late last night, and we came up the stairs, and we passed by the Jeanette Rankin room, and we saw Jeanette sitting on the bed. And she didn't have the heart to tell them that it was really her. And so now there are stories that the house is really haunted. That kind of goes to show you that you can't believe everything you hear. So this is also one of the really early homes here in the neighborhood. It was built in about 1875. It was actually remodeled in the 1890s to its present appearance. We have a few photographs of Ewing Street that shows the house in a completely different light, you know. But as it is now, it looked, you know, it was renovated in the 1890s and preserves its 1890s appearance today. So this was the home of Wilbur Fisk Sanders, who was one of the organizers, if not the organizer, of the vigilantes in Virginia City. He really made a name for himself as the prosecutor of the George Ives trial. George Ives was then hanged, and actually that was the catalyst to the forming of the Virginia City vigilantes. But Sanders was a really good attorney. He had the gift of oratory and was well known for his speeches. And his family continued to live in the house up until about 1929 or so. So in 1923, the family of James U. Sanders, who was one of the sons of Wilbur Fisk, was living with his family in the house. And at the time, he was the librarian for the Montana Historical Society. So James U. Sanders, in 1923, was the librarian at the Montana Historical Society. And he was creating an exhibit, a vigilante exhibit, and collecting ropes and things like that to put in this case. At that time, the Montana Historical Society was in the basement of the present Capitol. He received the skull supposedly of John Keene, that had been unearthed over in the neighborhood of the Hangman's Tree back in 1900. And it had been kept in the coroner's office, apparently. And so the coroner handed the skull over to James U. Sanders, who put it in the display case. Today, it's illegal to show, you know, human remains like that, but it wasn't illegal back then. So he placed the skull in the glass case. 2 weeks later, he was hit and killed by a driver over on Broadway. So I say, you know, you don't want to speak ill of the dead or handle those kinds of objects for artifacts, much less put them on display. So the Porter Flats behind me actually was built in 1884, and you know, it's just built on the heels of the railroad coming into Helena, which came in 1883. And it is a really good example of how homes began to be building up instead of out because there wasn't a lot of room. And this was one of the very first apartment buildings built in Helena. Apartment living was viewed as an enemy of domesticity back then because it was different than living in a boarding house. It was different because these particular apartments actually had kitchens within them. If you lived in a boarding house, you took your meals with the boarding house keeper. Everybody took their meals, you know, in the dining room. But here, people were separate, but they were still living in close quarters, and so it was not really considered an ideal way to live. But it became necessary, and you know, after that, you know, into the 1890s or so, it became much better accepted. At any rate, this apartment building really was the first apartment building in Helena, as I understand it, that had kitchen units. Of course, they didn't really have any plumbing exactly. They did have running water, but they didn't really have electricity or anything, so there were wood stoves, and people did do their own cooking. So it's pretty much the way it was before, although of course now they have electricity. So this was the Jewish synagogue, built in 1891, completed in 1891. And at the time that it was built, it was the first Jewish synagogue between St. Paul and Portland. So it was extremely important. And when they laid the cornerstone in 1890, people came from all over the region, not just Jewish people, but everyone. And Governor Toole gave a speech, and it was really quite an event. The building itself served as the synagogue until the 1930s. And it was, you know, beautiful Moorish architecture. At one time, there were onion domes on the two square towers. in 1933, when the state bought the building, actually the congregation had become too small really to care for the building, and so they made a deal with the state and let the state have it for $1 and a promise that the state would use it for a good and social purpose. And so the building actually had to be renovated, and all religious symbolism had to be removed for it to be used as state offices. And over the doorway it said "Gate to the Eternal" in Hebrew. That was removed. 10 Commandments on the inside were sandblasted off. The onion domes were removed, and actually they were copper, and this was during the Depression, so we think that they were probably recycled. At that time they were also resurfacing the dome on the Capitol, and copper was scarce, so we think that it was probably reused for that. They left the beautiful stained glass windows though, and the keyhole windows, especially on the sides, you can see where there was a second floor added, so they could add offices. And it's, you know, really very sensitively done at a time when preservation was hardly a word. You know, the state architect or whoever did the design really was very, very careful not to mar the appearance of the building. And so it served as the Office of Social Welfare until the 1980s, and then it became storage for the Montana Historical Society, and then finally in the late 1980s the Catholic Diocese of Helena purchased the building, and they have used the building ever since and been, you know, good stewards of it, and it holds the office of the bishop and the diocese archives. So Helena had this really important Jewish community. Many of the early merchants and professional people, service providers, were Jewish people who came from elsewhere. A lot of times they came from back east, from San Francisco, from California, and from Prussia and Eastern Europe. And we had it was a very vibrant community. The Home of Peace is the Jewish cemetery. That's this little cemetery that's tucked next to Capitol High School. And it is the oldest cemetery, active cemetery in Helena, begun in 1866, and it is still an active cemetery. Although the Jewish community today is smaller, it is still a very vibrant part of Helena, and it is just part of Helena's really incredible diversity. Early on, the Jewish folks who had businesses, they had hotels and dry goods stores, they were lawyers and doctors and all kinds of service providers. You know, those folks really were the people that rebuilt again and again and again after these terrible fires that we had. And I firmly believe, had it not been for the Jewish community, Helena would have become a ghost town, because many of those businesses were operated by the Jewish community members. And oftentimes, you know, they just rebuilt again and again. For example, Marcus Lissner, who was a hotelier for many years, the owner of the International Hotel, that hotel burned 2 or 3 different times, and every time he built it again, he rebuilt it so many times it became known as the Phoenix, because it always rose again from the ashes. And you know, these folks were really very important to Helena's early community. In fact, when the first Helena Board of Trade was published, out of some 27, I think it was 27 dry goods stores or businesses, 17 of them were owned by Jewish folks. And so those people really were very important to our early community. Looking at the lot where the new Central School is, I mean, that also is a very significant place in Helena history, because it was the highest point, and it does beautifully overlook the gulch. And it would have been, you know, it was the exact place where early residents decided to build the first cemetery, because it does overlook the town. And typically, if you look at cemeteries, in boom towns and in gold camps and that, they always built the cemetery on the highest point. In Virginia City, that's true with Boot Hill, and you can look at other places. Elkhorn, it's also high up overlooking the town, and so that was typical. And Helena is no exception there. So the cemetery was built there on the rise, on the ridge. And when they wanted to build the first school, just as the territorial capital was moving to Helena in 1875, city fathers wanted to build this grand educational institution to show that Helena was worthy of becoming the capital city. And they wanted to build it on the most prominent place. And so, of course, that ridgetop where the cemetery was the exact spot where they wanted to put the first school, the first graded school. And so when they did build Central School, they encountered a lot of bodies. Oftentimes they did not mark graves, and so it was difficult to tell where somebody was buried. And so they moved the graves mostly to Benton Avenue Cemetery, but bodies still kept surfacing. And when they built the high school, the first Helena High School, which was just adjacent to Central School, we have a wonderful letter from a woman saying when she was in third grade, they were building the high school, and this was in 1893. She and her friends would sit on the playground and watch them take bodies out of the ground, to build the foundation for the Helena High School. And so when the high school was completed in 1893, and that spring, there was a big rainstorm. It was April. And they had made a cut in Lawrence Street there to widen Lawrence Street. And a coffin washed out from the hillside into the street. You can imagine kids walking to Central School the next morning were traumatized to find this coffin that had burst open. And there was a miner with long red hair in the street, very well preserved. And, he was very quickly dispatched and buried in Benton Avenue Cemetery. But, that became a pretty famous story. Kids who go to Central School and know that story always claim to watch for bones on the playground. I mean, my daughter always looked for bones every time there was a rain, and they always thought they found them, but, they really never did. But anyway, Central School is important for that, and its third incarnation is there today, but that hillside is, of course, it is the most prominent place in Helena, and still, has a beautiful view of the gulch. Moving down from Central School, what's now the Labor Temple on Warren Street has a very interesting history, because back in the early years in the later 1860s, there were really many, many Southerners here in Helena, and there were Northerners too. And, I think that the community was very well integrated, but there was a Southern Methodist church and there was a Northern Methodist church here in Helena. And the Southern Methodist church is where that Labor Temple is today. And if you look at that building very closely, you'll see where the beautiful Gothic windows and the steeple have been changed. And you can see where the Gothic windows have been stuccoed over, but you can see the faint outline of the Gothic point, And so the Southern Methodists and the Northern Methodist was St. Paul's. Those two congregations worked together always. There was never any animosity. It's just that there were those two churches. And it wasn't until 1933 that the two congregations combined nationally, and also here in Helena. And that building then was no longer used as the Southern Methodist Church. But I think that's an interesting, it's really an interesting symbol for for our community. And then sort of across the street from there, there's a little gray apartment building. It's very small little gray painted brick building that's very early. Goes back to the 1870s. And it was one of the first funeral parlors here in Helena. It was the Taylor Undertaking establishment. And in the basement, apparently there was a showroom, and they advertised in the city directories the indestructible metal coffin. And metal coffin, not coffin, but casket. Coffins are made of wood, caskets are made of metal. These caskets were very popular because when the railroad came, there were laws passed that you couldn't ship a body in a pine box for obvious reasons. It had to be hermetically sealed in metal. And so metal caskets became popular with the coming of the railroad. And this Taylor Undertaking was one of the first places that sold these metal caskets, which I think is kind of interesting. Of course, the other place was the Herman building early on the corner there of Broadway and Warren. And Herman was a furniture making company, and he made the first coffins probably here in Helena. And later also sold metal caskets. But anyway, that's just kind of an, I think, interesting little thing. The Brown Block, which is down the way there, the Brown Block is that beautiful red brick building. And that is one of the earliest standing brick buildings in Helena, along with the Herman building. Those are made of that very soft Helena brick, made locally, and it's very flaky, and if you rub your hand on it, the powder will come off. And that building is interesting because if you look at the basement, at the line of the basement, you can see that there were windows down there because there are arches where the windows are now covered up by the street or by the sidewalk. The sidewalk was much, much lower at one time than it is now, and that's a really good example because if you look, you can just see the tops of the arches where those windows were at one time. The Brown Block, again, is really one of the very, very early still standing brick buildings. So walk around the corner and up to the assay office. The assay office was also really important to Helena's history. It kind of looks like a school, but it was built in 1875, designed by U.S. Treasury Department architects. And it was, except for the prison at Deer Lodge, it was the first federal presence in the territory. And the building, in the basement, there was a huge oven where they melted gold dust into gold bricks. I'm told that oven is still down there in the basement. The building now, of course, is apartment buildings, but until 1933, it was the Federal Assay Office. And when it was built, it was one of only 5 in the nation. They never did actually make currency there as they did at some of it. Wasn't a mint, but it was a Federal Assay Office, and it was a really great addition to the area because it meant that miners could actually take their gold dust locally and have it converted into cash. Before that, you'd have to send it to Philadelphia and it might not make it, because it was very dangerous to ship quantities of gold anywhere. So it was a really great coup to get that assay office here in Helena. And there on the corner of Ewing and Broadway, that lovely gray house that is the C.W. Cannon House is Helena's oldest high-style frame residence, built in about 1867. And it is a very unusual Gothic style. You don't usually see Gothic style buildings here in Helena. There are probably more in Virginia City than anywhere else, but Gothic was a style that they used for churches, but they also used them for homes in the 1860s here in Montana, because it was the style that people from the East brought with them, and it's what they remembered from their homes, you know. So we do find a few examples of Gothic style residences, and the Cannon House is one of those really important ones. And you can see the lovely, the Gothic windows in that house, and the steep pitched roof. So architecturally, it's a very important house.